Wonderful, thank you. I'm excited to be here this morning from a much colder and wetter place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So today I'm going to be talking about being actively ethical, a little bit of copyright, and into the topic. So our goal as UX people is to do responsible, intentional design, of course. And just because we can doesn't mean we should. And that's what I'll be talking a lot about today is how do we do the right work and not fall into the problems that we see often, unfortunately, in the news, where people have done things without actually thinking through whether they should or not. So this is early purposeful work. This is the UX work that we always do, but there's more. And it's not that I'm trying to dump more work on all of us. I know that we all do a lot of the work, the emotional baggage work and the thinking about the people and everything else. But this is one more thing until it becomes more common, where we need to think about the challenge that's being faced and whether or not it's AI friendly. Ideally, there are other people working on this, but we need to ask the questions too, and for whom, of course, and what are their needs, and will this actually make that improvement that people are expecting, and what might the machine be able to do better or faster, and what might it not be able to do due to the limitations, and then of course what is in and out of scope. And AI systems should be a partner. They should be augmenting our abilities as humans. So they are really good at finding patterns very quickly, doing fast things, doing calculations very quickly. They're also good at protecting us. They're the 4Ds of robotization: dull, dirty, dangerous, and dear. These are the activities that we probably want robots to do to protect us and to keep people safe, and because they're just boring. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility. Humans make AI, and we also need to think about humans, of course, with regard to what humans do when there's a robotic system or when there is another type of system. What are they doing in relation to those systems? So, because humans make these, and because we're humans, we are biased. And biases, you'll hear, you've already heard some about this in some of the other talks, and there's another talk today about bias, and they're just shortcuts. They help us to simplify our thinking. They help us to get to an answer more quickly. They're not inherently bad, but they often are misapplied, and they're implicit or invisible, so we're not always even aware of them. And they're not necessarily in sync with our conscious beliefs. And this is the most important thing to realize, is that we can manage and change them. When we have a thought about someone or something that we recognize as being part of our biases, we can address that. We can stop and think and take a moment to readdress how we're going to react to that. And so we can talk about them in non-threatening and productive ways, and we can talk to them with our teams. And this is hard work. This is a lot of thinking that people aren't used to doing necessarily. And our biases are caused by all of our experiences, the social classes that we grew up in, the social class that we may be in now, our resource availability, our education, our race, our gender, our sexuality, our culture, our theology, our tradition, and any other experiences that you have that have given you some thoughts into who you are and the world around you. Many of these were given to you much before you were really thinking even about the world, though. They come from our childhood. And because of this, all the systems that we make as humans have some sort of bias. Complete objectivity is misleading, and bias can have purpose and be helpful, but often we aren't necessarily aware of it. And that's where we have to do the hard work. The goal of reducing the unintended and harmful biases is really what we're going to focus on today. And when I say that complete objectivity is missing, even the data in these systems is biased. It's biased because someone had to pick which data to include and which to exclude. Someone had to decide whether or not the system was going to be more or less aggressive. So, for example, if you're thinking about treating different types of disease, different hospitals would treat that differently. And you want to think about that in the system that you're building and the data that you're collecting. And so those types of biases are purposeful and helpful, ideally. So we do this by collecting a diverse, talented, and multidisciplinary team and having them bring their varied skill sets. So different problem framing approaches. We want ML engineers, machine learning engineers, people who really understand the systems and their limitations, people who understand data, so data scientists, all these different individuals who work with artificial intelligence systems, as well as, of course, gender, race, and cultural differences, but also education. This is probably the most important because we find many large corporations particularly want to have people from certain schools with certain backgrounds, with certain different degrees. And if all of those people have gone to the same school, had the same professors, they are going to think very similarly, and they're going to miss the same things over and over again. And so by having a more diverse base in education and experiences and problem solving techniques and just the way we think about things, we're going to catch more issues before they happen. We also, of course, want to differ in age and disability and health status and any other ways that diversity can be represented. An important piece here is that diverse leadership is necessary to retain people. People don't tend to stick around in companies and organizations where they don't feel they are represented and they don't feel that there's a path forward. So that's probably one of the most important pieces of this, is making sure that leadership is in place ahead of time. And this is all about not lowering the bar, but rather extending it, making sure that we are making space at the table, making a larger tent, including more people in the work that we do. And this is because great minds do think differently. And that's what we want. We want a lot of different people thinking differently and asking tough questions. We want them to be thinking thoroughly about what we're doing and what the implications are of the work that we're doing. So that high value has been shown in many studies. This is from a Harvard Business Review article, where they really found that diverse teams focus more on facts. They process facts more carefully, and they're more innovative. And part of this is because they are aware of their own potential biases, and so they're also aware that everyone is biased in some ways. And they avoid the ways that those biases can stop them from seeing problems within the system. And so they're just more careful, they're more thoughtful, and their decision-making process is more purposeful. So AI does have great potential. I am a huge fan of AI, but we have to develop with caution. The future AIs may be able to do things like substitute human cognition and abilities. It's going to be a long time, though. And in the meantime, we must make sure that humans continue to be responsible for situations that involve life. So anything that might be important and long-standing in a human's life, such as their quality of life, their health, and their reputation. The AI really is there to ensure appropriate human judgment, but not replace it. And that's from the Defense Innovation Board here in the U.S. Department of Defense is working on their own AI set of ethics. And so we want to make sure that humans remain in control. And that doesn't mean every single aspect necessarily, but those big important things, big important decisions must be maintained by humans. One way that a lot of organizations are doing this is by adopting technology ethics. And the good thing about a set of ethics, they can harmonize as cultural variations. So when you bring a team together with people with very different backgrounds, they're going to think differently, which is great, but they may also not share a lot of the same ideas about what is the right thing to do in this particular situation. And so this can help to harmonize that as well as balancing to the pace of change. So a lot of industry pressure is to release very quickly and to do work very quickly, which is not bad necessarily, but we do want to take the time to really think through the work that we're doing and to do the work to identify the issues that may arise. So this gives us explicit permission to consider and question the breadth of implications, the work that we're doing and how we're doing it and why we're doing it. And so by coalescing on a shared set of technology ethics, this is the Montreal Declaration of Responsible AI. They have 10 areas that they cover, and this is a very broad set. This is the one I usually recommend people start with because it is so broad, it covers almost all situations. But this isn't necessarily enough. And I'll go through why and how you can work with a set of technology ethics to do this work. But in the meantime, you have a diverse, inclusive set of leadership in the ideal situation, diverse multidisciplinary teams, and shared sets of technical ethics so that you can move forward and get this work done. So now I'm going to talk about how we actually do the work, because there is that mystery there. You can look at a set of technical ethics, and often it will have very vague terms. So do no harm or something similar to that. And it's hard to figure out what we should be doing with that. How should we get to making that trustable, ethical AI system? And so what we need to do is activate curiosity. And I'm not going to get very deep into these methods today, but I will touch on them briefly. Abusability testing was popularized by Dan Brown, and Black Mirror episodes were popularized by Casey Feisler. And this is inspired by the British dystopian sci-fi series you may have seen. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. And these both are very similar and build on each other as far as really thinking about the worst case scenario. And by identifying those worst case scenarios, we are then more prepared for anything that can happen. And we will work on ways to mitigate that and develop them. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. We can also do things like flip it to test it. This is great for a persona or another activity where you've identified a scenario and you want to see if perhaps it's being affected by your bias. You can change the individuals that you're describing and see if it still fits. And if it doesn't, then you probably are using your biases instead of reality, or at least fairness. And the implicit association test was developed by Harvard University. It's something you can take online. Your whole team can take it if you're in a good team where you can share this kind of information. And it helps you to see where your implicit biases are. Who are the people that you are more likely to be biased against? And all of these are about speculating about the system misuse and abuse, and thinking about those potential unwanted or unintended consequences. And without these types of activities, we're much more likely to have a system that is going to hurt people. We really need to be aggressive about this work and make sure that it gets done. One more activity you can do is just to reward team members for finding ethics bugs. This is something that was suggested by Dr. Ayanna Howard. She was interviewed on the Artificial Intelligence podcast with Lex Friedman, and she talks a lot about this type of work. She does a lot of work in AI and ethics, and I highly recommend looking at her up and thinking about how you can get your team to be involved in this work more fully. And those team members are going to need to be involved in these conversations. So these conversations really need to include not just the UX team, although we often are going to be the ones suggesting this work get done, but also the rest of the group. And I'm going to talk about a UX framework that will help to guide these conversations, but these are the difficult topics we're going to be thinking about. What do we value? Who could be hurt? What lines won't our AI cross? And how are we shifting power? Who's gaining and who's losing from the system that we're building? And then how are we going to track our progress? How will we know that we're being successful in the work that we're doing? And there are many more questions that we need to ask. And that's what makes this work really uncomfortable. And it's new work as well. It's work that people have generally not had any training in, not any experience. Most people from a computer science or a machine learning background haven't had a class in ethics or philosophy. And so this is very uncomfortable work for them. And we need to get used to being uncomfortable. It's ethical design is not superficial. Laura Kalbeck talks about this. We really need to get used to having more difficult conversations. Technology has for far too long gone without these conversations, and we need to make sure they become part of the work. One way to prompt conversations is this checklist I've been working on. And the idea is that you pair this checklist with the technical ethics and really go through and ensure that you're doing the work. Often what we find is by going through this type of checklist, you end up finding more work that needs to be done. So for example, if you're working with a backlog, you may fill your backlog with a lot of new work that needs to be done. And the QR code there for download, and I'll make sure that we can make this available to you as well. But the goal for this work is to bridge the gap between statements like do no harm that you might find in this technical ethics and the reality of building a software product or an AI system. We want to reduce the risk and unwanted bias, and we also need to support the inspection and mitigation planning that needs to be done to keep the system as high quality as possible. This is the framework that was used to develop that checklist, and I'll go through this briefly with a scenario. There are 4 areas: accountable to humans, cognizant of speculative risk and benefits, respectful and secure, and honest and usable. And I'll get into these in a minute. The scenario that we're going to talk through is a RightStaff Scenario. So this is a system, an AI system that was developed to do shift scheduling. So in restaurants and fast food type situations, and in other retail stores and things like that, there are shifts that people need to be scheduled onto. And typically the store managers manage that process. And the goals of this system are to reduce the bias of shift selection and to do faster staffing decisions and scheduling. In the past, what has happened is these managers have been scheduling their friends or the easiest people into the best shifts. And so the people who are harder to schedule or who they don't like as much end up with the worst shifts. And so this continues to propagate the bias, and the same people continue to have trouble getting good shifts. And so the system will help to reduce that problem. So the accountable to humans piece of the framework is about ensuring humans have ultimate control, the control I talked about earlier today already. The ability to monitor and control risk, so understanding what's going on in the system and why, and getting some information about it, and also being able to make those final decisions I mentioned earlier. So with regard to this system, first off, we want to make sure that somebody can turn the system off, that humans can unplug the machines. Grady Booch talks about this in his TED Talk. That's a really important aspect of any system and gives ultimate control to the humans. So that's the first thing that we always need to make sure is that someone knows how to turn it off and that there's a process for that. Along with that, we need to make sure that any of the decisions that are made need to be able to be explained so that the system is giving appropriate information to the users of the system, that humans are able to override or appeal and reverse any decisions that the system makes. So if the system makes the wrong decision, for example, with RightStaff, a manager should be able to reschedule people. So if there is a problem and somebody has a doctor's appointment or whatever it is, a manager can just go right in and do what they need to do to reschedule versus trying to work with the system to understand the situation. They can just go in and make that change quickly. The responsibilities also need to be explicitly defined between the AI system and the humans. So for the example in RightStaff, who picks employees to schedule? Who would define the shifts? Who would determine the method for integrating new information? So if there was sick time that needed to be integrated, if someone wasn't feeling well, or if there was a resignation, how would that information be adjusted in that system? And would the AI system be able to do that on its own, or would the manager be expected to do that? For abusability testing, to be able to do this type of activity, we can think about, for example, a feature that is added to enable RightStaff to turn off by itself. So if in the scenario we are going to allow that to occur, what are the limits to that functionality? When could it not turn itself off? When would we want it to turn itself off? How could this be abused or misused by someone who is trying to change the system's operations or trying to gain an advantage in their schedule? What are the implications of being able to turn itself off and on? And what are the risks? So by thinking through the scenario, we can then use that information, use that knowledge to apply to other situations as well. The second area of the framework is being cognizant of speculative risks and benefits. So we want to identify the full range of harmful and malicious use as well as the good and beneficial use of the system. And that way we understand the scope. We also want to make sure that we think about any unintended or unwanted consequences. Because again, if we don't think about them, it'll be inevitable that they'll occur. So we need to do that ahead of time. And so one way to do this is with UX research, of course, and activating curiosity in the team. So by speculating about the misuse and abuse on our own, that's extremely helpful. We can also talk to users, interview users, observe users doing various activities, understand how the current system is working, and then look at potentially severe abuse and consequences. And that might come from interviewing managers or something else as well. And the perspectives that we also want to make sure that we gain are those of people in frequently marginalized groups because they are more likely to be forgotten, unfortunately, or to be affected inadvertently by the system. And so by making sure that we're taking those perspectives into account, we're much more likely, again, to build a system that is not harming people inadvertently. also by using the Black Mirror episode. So the idea of thinking about the worst case scenario, what could absolutely be the worst situation that could occur. You can see an example of a workshop that I participated in a couple of years ago, and the workshop that I ran earlier in this conference was based on that workshop. Parts of it were anyway. So the Black Mirror episode for RightStaff would be if RightStaff began prioritizing people with easier schedules. So it doesn't sound so bad at first, but if you think about the managers continuing to approve those schedules and reinforcing that issue, the people who were previously discriminated against are still discriminated against. So the system has actually failed if this is to occur. So how could we prevent that from happening? What would we need to do to prevent this from happening in the system? What kind of prevention tactics can we use, mitigation tactics if we have to, if we can't prevent it? Some other problems could come about, and we can think about other issues as well. So the another way that we can help to reduce harm is just by creating communication and mitigation plans. So thinking about those unwanted consequences, that Black Mirror episode I just spoke about, how would that be reported? What is the process for that to occur? Who can report it? Can an employee report that they are continuing to get the shifts that they thought the system was supposed to fix? Is it a manager's responsibility? Is there someone else who can report it? Who can they report to and when? How can we turn the system off? And if we turn the system off, what are the consequences of that? And who gets notified that the system is not working or is offline, or is there another system that they can use instead? We need to think about all this ahead of time so that if something does happen, we're prepared and we're not left wondering what we should do with the system continuing to harm people and make poor scheduling decisions in this case. So respectful and secure is the third area of the framework, and this speaks to the values of humanity, ethics, equity, fairness, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. And part of this is just respecting privacy and data rights. And we've had a few talks about that during this conference. And the big thing here is simply not collecting more data than we need, making sure that we are only collecting the information that we absolutely need and that we're taking responsibility for that data. And that if we don't need a piece of information, we don't ask for it. That way we don't expose people to more risk than necessary. We also need to make sure the systems are robust, valid, and reliable in all the meanings of those words, and provide understandable security, making sure that everyone knows how they can access the system and when the system and how the system is protecting their information. So with RightStaff, we want to make sure that there is clarity as far as who is able to access the information, who has visibility to the changes in the schedule. So that example where someone has a doctor's appointment, not everyone needs to know that. How do we protect that information? How do we make sure that only the people who should have that information have access to it? And how is that information used in general? Is that always stored in the system? Is there a way to protect those reasons unless absolutely necessary, if the information is absolutely needed? And how is the personal information, personally identifiable information of employees protected? What are we doing to make sure? In the US, it's a social security number. What other types of really important information, addresses and phone numbers and things like that, what are we doing to make sure that those are not put into the public, or even to make sure that access isn't gained by anyone who should not have access? The fourth aspect is honest and usable. This is about valuing transparency with the goal of engendering trust. We want to make sure that the system is always obvious about its use, that it's explicitly stating its identity as an AI system. This is particularly important with chatbots and with other systems where a human might potentially not realize that they're dealing with an AI system. The system should always be identifying itself so that there is no feelings of deceit, that the system is not making judgments or implying that it's a human when it's not. It should be very clear. And to be fair, we should also be trying to remove the unwanted bias in our data. We need to show awareness of the data and the desirable bias that's in the system, and to over communicate on any issues that we know are a problem. So with RightStaff, this means that we need to build a system to reduce the known bias in the existing system and make it easy to report bias. One moment. Thank you. And so we need to make sure that we are providing as much information as we can. When there is a bias in the system, we need to explicitly make it clear to people what that bias is and make sure that everyone understands it. So, the example I used earlier with a hospital that maybe is more aggressive or less aggressive in a treatment, we want to make sure that people are aware of that when they're using that system. So with right staff, again, we want to just make sure that people can report it when they realize it and ideally prevent it if at all possible. So we aren't perfect, and AI systems that we build will definitely not be perfect. We need to empower diverse teams and inclusive environments and adopt technical ethics so that we can all align on the same ideas and understand what we want to do. And encourage deep conversations with a checklist, ideally, or any other system that you prefer to make sure that you're really asking tough questions, that you're really digging deep into this work. And to activate curiosity, we want people to be speculative and imaginative and use the skills that we have as UX practitioners to help to build that skill in other people so that we're not the only people asking those tough questions, but that everyone's taking some responsibility in doing this hard work. I encourage you all to evangelize for human values and to do ethical, transparent, and fair work. And I think we have some time for some questions, and I have my contact information here if you'd like to continue the conversation.